Let's get talking now. Joining me is the Director of Research, our Socio-Economic Research Institute from South Africa, Angelo Ficks. It's good to have you join us on The World Now on TVC News. How do you view these attacks on foreign nationals in your country?
So these are indeed very, very tragic and very, very serious and alarming moments of violence in which it seems as if people who are identified as being Africans who are not South African are being targeted. And this is not being helped by a legacy of and current crisis of poor policing by the South African state, concerns around the gathering of intelligence which could head off and identify the figures behind the waves of attacks. And also, more importantly, it's being flamed and it's being inflamed by the spreading of rumors and very, very unreliable and false information, not just across social media, but across even mainstream media. So this is a moment, and I think it's important for all people in South Africa and across the continent to pause and to ask ourselves, how do we address the emergency situation of these particular attacks, and how do we plan going ahead to prevent the repetition of these as we have seen them not only in South Africa, but principally in South Africa since 2008.
And in dispelling the rumors and the untruths, as you put it, what would you have the world really know about this violence?
So, as you've indicated, the number of people who've been targeted who happen to be Nigerians is not exclusive of other people who've also died. Mozambique has raised concerns about the treatment of its citizens in South Africa, and not just in the latest wave, but before. And beyond that, it's also important to distinguish between the varieties of ways and means by which people meet their end. South Africa is an incredibly violent country. It has unacceptably high levels of violence against poor people, violence against women, and an incredibly unacceptable rate of murder for a country that is not at war or at civil war. These are issues that are raised by the South African population and by people who are living in South Africa who are not necessarily citizens. So there is indeed an issue of xenophobia in the South African social fabric that must be addressed as a matter of urgency by South African civic society and by South Africa's government. The issues of poor policing must be addressed by South Africa's government, and I think it is important to have intergovernmental dialogue around the handling of the current crisis. Beyond that, I think that the statements coming out of the Nigerian government officials indicating that targeting South African businesses in Nigeria is not serving the purpose. Similarly, South African government officials have had to and are being increasingly forced to come out and indicate that any form of violence directed at people is unacceptable, because it turns out that some of the people killed in the latest wave of violence weren't foreigners, they were South Africans, because in the mob violence, no distinction is often made between people who happen to be in a scene and are identified and seen to be something that they may not be.
Right. And talking about reactions, the Nigerian government has also condemned the violence against South African-linked businesses here in the country, saying it doesn't help matters, indeed. And we've also seen African leaders boycotting world events being hosted in South Africa, as well as celebrities, boycotting or refusing to visit South Africa as a result of this violence there. How do you react?
So one clarification is that the president of Rwanda, Mr. Kagame, had indicated last week, before any of this was happening, that he would not be attending. And so it's not clear that all of the leaders who are not arriving chose to respond to this. Some certainly, it seems, have. In terms of the kind of so-called cultural boycott of people who are suggesting that they will not, that may send a message to South Africans that it's time in their numbers to stand up against this kind of violence. But I think it doesn't only stop there. It is important for the South African state, but also for states across the continent, to start educating citizens far more critically that actually the people who are being targeted in these attacks, and it's not unique to South Africa, we've seen waves of this across the continent, are indeed scapegoats and are simply being identified and dealt with in the ways that they are, dehumanized because they're convenient and because they're not protected. It is important that I think we start thinking of the African Union and the Pan-African Pact as something that needs to be instituted at the community level, that ordinary people begin to think so, and the differences between us as Africans on the continent need to be dealt with as not differences that should lead to violence. That said, I think we must accept that South Africa does have very important homework to do and must deal with the fact that as a post-independent society, it has incredibly high rates of violence.
Right.
Today, even citizens
Right.
complaining about violence against women.
Angelo Ficks, thank you very much for your contributions on The World Now.